Hi.
This is Roger.
Hi, Roger. How are you?
I've got two
Welcome to Mayshad Presents and our Women in Money series. Today, our theme is your financial health during economic disruption. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Jan Mercer-Doms, and I'm the Vice President of Mayshad Choice. We produce, moderate, and distribute a series of events for smart, highly accomplished women to connect, engage, and support champion equity for women. And we continuously invest in professional and personal opportunities for our network. You may follow us on joinmayshad.com. Thank you so much again for spending your time with us here this morning. We know that as we discover new meaning in our remote work life, that we're thrilled to be able to bring you digital opportunities such as this. And I'm also very thrilled today to introduce Roger Sachs, Managing Director at Stifel, a diversified global wealth management and investment banking company. Roger has been an incredibly strong advocate for the championing of women, both professionally and personally. And Roger and I had connected many years ago through our own networking efforts. And we're thrilled that Roger has been a part of helping to grow and curate and develop the Mayshad ecosystem of highly accomplished professional women as well. Thank you, Roger, for being with us here today.
Thank you, Jan, and likewise, I have been very happy and pleased to be part of the Women's Empowerment Network that you have, and Mayshad has been a tremendous partner with Stifel, so very happy to be here today. I'm also very honored to bring access to all of you to my firm's Chief Economist, Lindsey Piegza. Let me just give you a quick commercial and background on Stifel for those of you who I haven't had a chance to meet yet, and I'll introduce Lindsey. Stifel is a financial services firm with a focus on personal wealth management and investment banking. We're 130 years old. There's 400 offices across the United States, over 7,000 employees. We manage over $70 billion of assets under management, and depending on the day of the week, we're somewhere around the seventh largest wealth management firm in the country. I'm in our wealth management area. I've been doing this for 30 years, and I've never seen something as unique as the events we're going through right now. For those of you who have financial advisors, hopefully they've been reaching out to you during this chaos. There's a lot of proactive actions that people should be taking. If they haven't been reaching out to you, shame on them. I would strongly encourage you to think about things and don't look at this as a time to put your head in the sand. With that, I do want to also offer up, for those of you who don't have financial advisors and you're confused, contact me, contact Jan, who will then forward you to me. I'll either work with you or I can put you in touch with people who can. So, the commercial aside, I do want to introduce you to our Chief Economist, Lindsey Piegza, Dr. Lindsey Piegza. Lindsey is a tremendous resource within our firm. She's very visible throughout on a daily basis. Many of you may have already seen her. She frequents the TV stations of CNBC, Bloomberg, CNN. She's been written up in the Harvard Business Journal and other academic publications. She's also been awarded the 2019 Woman of Influence by the Chicago Business Journal, so a very relevant award for this audience. Hopefully the technology will work today. Lindsey has forwarded a bunch of slides to Jan and her team at Mayshad that we're going to flip through, and Lindsey's going to give you her current presentation, which, by the way, changes by the hour right now. So, there's going to be a good opportunity to ask some questions at the end. I'm going to hand it off to Lindsey. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Roger, and thank you, Jan, and welcome, everyone. I sincerely appreciate you joining us today and giving me this opportunity to address the current volatile economic environment that we find ourselves in. There's a lot to touch on, but what I want to focus on, I want to focus on the latest moves that we've seen from our federal officials, both the Federal Reserve and the federal government. the motivation and the potential impact of these policies, as well as an updated outlook of where we see the U.S. economy headed, because that's really the biggest question that a lot of us have on our minds. And let's begin with the Federal Reserve on slide 1. As Roger mentioned, hopefully most of you have that PowerPoint in front of you. So we'll start here on slide 1. Now, I don't want to take the time and walk through all of the latest moves of the Federal Reserve, but I think that we can stipulate at this point, it's pretty clear the unprecedented steps the Fed has taken to stabilize the market and keep markets functional, including a no-limit commitment to asset purchases and essentially near daily announcements of liquidity injections. So it's clear the Fed has taken extraordinary measures beyond even what was taken during the financial crisis, if you remember. Again, I'm not going to go through all of them, but the intention, as we see the list here, is quite long. The intention is three-pronged. One, the Fed wants to make sure that they support the flow of credit to households and businesses so that we're able to weather this storm. They also want to continue to foster strong growth and inflation conditions in line with their official dual mandate. And third, they want to promote and ensure a functioning financial market, the Fed's sort of, let's say, unofficial third mandate. Now, with rates already at historically low levels as we entered into 2020, and we're reminded here on slide 2, it is somewhat hard to believe that the committee was convinced a further reduction, effectively down to zero at this point, would provide a meaningful boost to either spending or investment. Although, to be fair, I do think it's important to point out that lower rates will help supplement consumer spending, at least on the margin, particularly as we talk about workers, hourly workers specifically, being the hardest hit with reduced work weeks, temporary layoffs, etc. So most of the support from the Federal Reserve is actually going to stem through these non-traditional supports put in place. Lowering rates to zero is nice, but again, rates were already historically low. So all of these non-traditional supports, they were designed to keep the financial system functional in this time of crisis. Whether we're talking about the different liquidities or the different liquidity injections or the different liquidity programs, the idea is to encourage banks to use capital, to use liquidity buffers, to supplement and support lending, as opposed to tightening or choking off credit, which could potentially exacerbate the negative impact on businesses and, of course, by extension, then the broader economy. Of course, the question remains, have these programs really been successful? Now, I know it's been a short period of time, but have they been successful over just the past couple of weeks? Turning to slide 3, some would argue there has been some relief in terms of dollar liquidity overseas, although credit markets still indicate a solvency crisis. I'm not necessarily saying a worsening crisis from where we began, but a crisis nonetheless. And the commercial paper market, which has received a notable amount of attention as of late, particularly in the media, as we can see here, still looking at slide 3, this is still experiencing stress with ample volatility in spread. So it has helped somewhat keeping markets liquid, but again, we're still seeing a lot of volatility, a lot of stress in the marketplace. The next question that I think is important that I assume a lot of you have been thinking about is, why did the Fed need to take such drastic action in such a short period of time? Because remember, we're talking about 2 emergency round rate cuts, one of which came just 2 days before the scheduled March FOMC meeting. Remember that Sunday night, late night emergency rate cut. And then, of course, we've seen almost daily announcements, as I mentioned, of further liquidity injections and funding programs. So why the sense of one, turning to slide 4, what we were seeing at the time and have continued to see is expanded testing and changes in government policy. As the number of tests being administered around the country dramatically increases, so too are the number of reported cases of COVID-19. Not only that Monday morning, following the Fed's emergency measures Sunday night on the 15th, but on a daily basis since then. Looking here, I'm sure you guys are familiar with this chart. You can see the dramatic rise in exposure. So the Fed was very anxious to get out ahead of the latest announcement of the coronavirus cases across the country, reaching a new high of X times 20 or 30 or whatever the figure may be. Also, as the number of cases rise, state and local governments in particular have been taking further action to stem the spread of the virus in their communities. And these increasingly draconian measures, while they may be warranted, they do have a psychological impact on the average American, which can impact behaviors and exacerbate fear factors. Again, the Fed wanted to get out ahead of even another few days of these closures and restrictions being implemented. The second reason that the Fed acted with such a sense of immediacy was further weakness in China. And we can see this turning to slide 5. At this point, the data is still moderately stable, at least in the rearview mirror. Of course, we did see a huge jump in claims this morning, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But a lot of the data is still reflecting February, early March, coming in at a moderately stable level. The Chinese economy, however, was already seeing a realized impact on the data as a result of the coronavirus, really retarding production and consumption for quite some time. The latest figures in terms of industrial output, just to give you an idea, fell 14%. Retail sales, as we're looking at here on slide 5, plunged over 20%. The unemployment rate in China jumped to the highest level ever reported. So we were already seeing this massive downturn in the Chinese data, undermining earlier projections that it was going to be just sort of a short-lived dip into negative territory in terms of the Chinese economy, and then the expected rebound to near 10% growth in Q2, Q3. But such a forecast was based on the presumption that the coronavirus would actually be contained in the very near term. Production would be restored quickly, and the scope would be very narrow, both in the standpoint of duration and intensity, all of which seemed overly optimistic. Then you layer on the beginning of these realized figures showing this compounded downturn, and indeed that optimistic scenario seems relatively unrealistic at this point. In fact, let's turn to slide 6. And when we factor in some of these latest figures that we've been seeing from the Chinese economy is actually on track for a much steeper decline to the tune of about 20, maybe 25% decline in growth in just the first 2 months of the quarter. Now, I'm not suggesting a similar scenario here in the U.S. We're not looking for not quite that dramatic of a decline. But investors here in the U.S. are beginning to understand the dramatic economic costs that could potentially result in the domestic economy from the coronavirus directly, but more importantly, from the policies that we're putting in place to combat the coronavirus, social distancing, shutting down segments of the economy. These can have very serious impacts on the broader growth prospects of the country. So another reason that the Fed really sought to expedite their schedule and get that myriad of policy adjustments in place. Now, let's turn to the U.S. on slide 7 and talk about our outlook for the U.S. As I mentioned, it's not quite as dire as the expectations for China. Broadly speaking, we do maintain a relatively optimistic base case scenario for the U.S. economy, which is somewhere between the best case and worst case scenarios. The best case being a quick V-shaped rebound with only a temporary dip into negative territory in the second quarter, with the virus contained any day now. And in fact, initially, that was our base case scenario. The worst case being a prolonged depression-like scenario, so depression with a D, not R, with the spread of the virus and domestic weakness extended well into the second half of the year. Now, our base case, our revised base case at this point is somewhere between these two extremes. We do expect a sizable disruption, likely to lead to a technical recession or 2 consecutive quarters of negative output. Now, compared to some predictions of a second-round Great Depression, again, not recession, depression, we do remain optimistic that with a strong response from the Fed, which we've already seen, we outlined that on slide 1, as well as the federal government, which could be coming soon, cross your fingers, the U.S. economy can slowly recover. And I say slowly recover because we do anticipate a U-shaped recovery, nearing a pre-corona trend pace as we head further into the end of 2020, more likely into the early part of 2021. But it's not going to be a sort of flip the switch scenario. It will take time for businesses to come back online after being shut down for weeks. It will take time to get workers back online, retap supply chains. And on the demand side, consumers are going to be equally as slow to move back into the marketplace, restricted by either lingering fears of the virus or personal finances. The U.S. is likely to be the hardest hit in the second quarter, with the data, as I mentioned, not truly indicating the impact, the negative impact of global supply chain disruptions, as well as the effect of policies such as schools and business closures, social distancing, until the March data begins to filter in at the earliest. Or for many, we may not even see this until the April reports. So what does this mean for first quarter? Well, with January and February relatively unscathed, at least if from the impact of the virus, the impact on Q1 is likely to be minimal. So we see growth only contracting between 1% to 2% in the first quarter before a much larger, much more sizable contraction of roughly 10 to 15% in the second quarter. And again, from there, we don't see a V-shaped recovery, although we'd like to. We see the rising risks of this disease continuing to contract economic growth and prosperity for quite some time. So again, that slower, more tepid upswing. While not our base case scenario, I do want to mention, depending on the depth and duration of the impact, as Roger mentioned, things are very fluid. These are constantly changing, not only week to week, day to day, hour by hour, to be honest. And as we see some of these scenarios push out in terms of timeline, in terms of the impact on from a case number standpoint, the more likely we could see a depressionary scenario. Again, depressionary with a D. This could become a reality if we start to see some of these more dire calendar calls that this is extended into May, June, or even beyond. At this stage, however, with expectations that we do have the virus contained by the end of April, we would assign less than a 15% chance to an outright depressionary scenario, still leaving the U.S. in a very hard-hit recessionary scenario. But in either case, we're kind of splitting hairs here. The U.S. economy does face a very difficult and potentially more difficult pathway. Even with the best of luck from here, the domestic economy and the global economy is going to take a hit, if from nothing more than a market slowdown in the world's second largest economy. A very challenging reality that's difficult for investors to swallow, even after all of these emergency measures that the Fed has taken, even after the expected package from Washington, but a reality that the market does seem to be all too aware of. Now, the Fed, as I mentioned, is doing all they can, essentially taking a whatever it takes stance. The federal government also seems to be a little more engaged in providing support, all aimed to, one, help workers who miss paychecks in companies that lose business, particularly retailers and restaurants, and two, provide broad support to the economy to help stave off or at least soften a potential recession. But of course, this is an election year, so we're going to continue to see ongoing disagreements along the way as discussions continue into Friday's vote over the best way to accomplish these goals, how large a stimulus is needed, the details, how great the impact on the economy will be. Meanwhile, investors are left struggling with questions of sufficiency and efficiency of these different programs, as well as the potential side effects of such radical policies, including the price tag. Remember, we're already facing a $1.5 trillion deficit for 2020 before accounting for any of the spending to combat the coronavirus. $1.5 trillion. So this is continuing the wild ride for investors, particularly in the equity markets, as we're reminded on slide 8. I'm sure everyone's familiar, everyone's been glued to their TV, but just as a reminder, these tremendous ups and downs, these wild swings. Now, one of my biggest concerns let me back up here. We also have to remember that this virus it's a very individualistic virus, and we're all being impacted in very different ways. Some people are struggling to work from home and manage their careers and their families with schools being closed. Some are struggling to keep businesses afloat. They've spent 5-10 years of their life building from the ground up, and now the government is telling them that they have to shut their doors. I'll be honest, one of my biggest concerns, I shared with Roger and Jan, I'm due in about 6 weeks, and I'm concerned that the hospitals at that point will be overrun and they're going to send me back home or down by the river to give birth. So we're all being impacted by this in one way or the other. And it's going to be very difficult for the government to address all of these issues. But they're doing the best they can from the standpoint of, can we help bridge individuals and businesses from a financial standpoint to help them get through this hard time? Now, $2 trillion sounds like an exorbitant amount of money, but already we know that that is not going to cover the complete loss of income, revenues, consumption, spending. So even with $2 trillion expenditures, we are still going to see a very hard hit that we are personally going to feel in our pocketbooks. And of course, the economy is going to reflect with a very precipitous decline in growth. And the concern, again, going forward is an insufficient policy response. The Fed is doing everything they can. The federal government is struggling to provide the needed support, but the less the impact, the more panic and more fear factors become elevated, actually exacerbating the potential downward pressure on the market and the broader economy. So it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And this increases the potential for that depressionary scenario, perpetuating or extending this low interest rate environment. And we do expect this to stay for quite some time. Again, as I talked about, the economy being under extreme pressure through the end of the year. Now, I do want to end on a positive note. Turning to the last slide, slide 9, I want to remind all of our listeners that while we do face challenges in the near term, and this can be a very scary time, it is important to remember that we have faced tough times before. And despite the near-term pain, on a long-term trajectory, we do wholeheartedly expect the U.S. economy to eventually reemerge back to a more robust pathway. We remain the largest, most liquid market in the world with one of the most entrepreneurial labor forces. So essentially, times are tough right now, and it feels like we've been going through this for weeks or months, but we will get through this. The economy will eventually emerge, and we will talk about a higher, longer-term pathway back to that pre-corona trend pace environment. And with that, I want to thank you again for joining us today, and I will turn it back over to my colleagues, Jan and Roger.
Jan, I'll let you take over. I think you have the technical capabilities to take any questions or throw in a few of your own.
Yes, thank you so much, Lindsey and Roger. That was a very informative, both macro and micro presentation. I think that really helps to set the stage for anticipating what's to come, but then also to help us understand that this is a moment in time and there is opportunity on the other side of that. We invite everyone who's listening and watching today to please send us your questions. We have the tremendous opportunity to have Lindsey with us this morning. And so while we encourage questions, we do encourage you to keep them focused on the larger economy and less about individual investment decisions, because of course they can't answer those questions in a public forum such as this. And we invite you to have those conversations with them privately, but would love to hear from you in the sense of what you're thinking and feeling, and use this as a soundboard to be able to connect with the community at large. Lindsey, one question that's come through is, as we think about the potential opportunities that exist during times like this when the markets are in such extreme fluctuation from a day-to-day perspective, how do we assess when those are moments and times to be able to seize and perhaps invest in the stock market?
Well, timing is very difficult, and I don't think that any of us have a crystal ball to know when the perfect time to get into the market or get out of the market is. But I think from a longer-term perspective, you want to take the standpoint of what industries are being the hardest hit that we anticipate would not disappear when we actually find our way through this. So some of the industries that are being hard hit are in the retail sector, are in the travel sector. And if you're of the mindset that the U.S. economy it would be virtually impossible for the U.S. economy to continue without the existence of the airlines, without the existence of hotels or cruise lines, maybe. That would be an area of opportunity that I would tend to focus on. Now, of course, I certainly can't advise you on those individual sectors. I would encourage you to talk to your individual brokers. But again, it's finding those storylines of some of these industries are taking the brunt of the pain, that you would expect to fully emerge on the other side of this epidemic. So maybe removing yourself from the immediate sense of no one can fly, no one can go out to eat, no one can shop, and try to imagine the recovery and where some of those bright spots would be.
That's excellent advice. Thank you, Lindsey. Here's another question that's come through. What can small businesses with little cash flow do in the next few weeks to protect the future of their businesses?
That's something that the federal government is working on right now. That is one of the questions that they want to address, because businesses are struggling to cover expenses. They're struggling to cover payroll. They're struggling to cover rent. They're struggling to cover shipment receipts. And so businesses right now need that bridge loan in order to cover those immediate liquidity needs. And that's something that is included in the stimulus package, but also this is something that small businesses can work with their bankers on. There's a lot of different provisions and different adjustments that bankers can provide on loans, lines of credit that they can tap into that can help them bypass this immediate pressure point and continue to remain solvent. It can be anything from skipped payments to renegotiating loan conditions to increasing lines of credit. And this is something that I would absolutely encourage you to talk with your bankers about, because the federal government has put a lot of pressure on banks and given them a lot of leniency as well to work with their customers. So as the customer, I do think a lot of this is on you to go to your banker and say, look, what can we do to immediately address my liquidity needs so that I don't have to go out of business, but that I don't have to lay off 5, 10, 50 employees and exacerbate some of the pain that's being felt on the individual level.
Lindsey, so much of our community here at Mayshad is centralized here in New York City. We have a network of over 10,000 highly accomplished women that participate actively in the programming efforts that we do, but we also have 1.3 million as a part of our larger social network as well. And so we have folks from all over the world who are listening to this conversation right now. And many of us are in the corporate sector and others are entrepreneurs and business owners, to your point, across really diverse industries. So some of us have been hit and impacted much harder than others. And is it true that in the $2.2 trillion relief package that the Senate has passed, that there is an expanded definition around what unemployment looks like and could include? So is it true that now unemployment claims could cover also the self-employed and independent contractors? And if you could speak to that, that would be amazing.
So there are some different provisions being included in the bill. There's a lot of different components. In terms of, you're asking specifically about the unemployment insurance?
Yes, it's as this individual pointed out who submitted the questions, payments to individuals expanded unemployment coverage to include independent contractors and.
Yes, absolutely. So $250 billion of the $2 trillion stimulus package is going for expanded unemployment insurance. And the unemployment insurance will now cover more categories of workers, including both contractors, as you mentioned, as well as gig workers. So it is expanding what the normal range of coverage would be. Benefits themselves are also extended then from 36 weeks to 39 weeks. And for the first 4 months, benefits will increase by up to $600 a week. So the bill is trying to address some of the individuals that would typically be left behind in terms of unemployment insurance. And that's part of the reason, not just a part of the reason we saw such an extreme increase in those initial jobless claims, because the pool now extends to include those contractors and gig workers as well.
Another question that just came in, what can we as individuals do personally right now to stimulate the economy?
Well, that's a very selfless question. Most people are worried about stimulating their own financial balance sheet. I think right now, as the average household, there's not much we can do from a luxury or discretionary standpoint of expenditures. We can't go out and take a vacation. We can't go on a cruise or really leave our house in many cases, depending on the state that you're in, if you have a shelter-in-place order. But in terms of keeping the economy afloat, keep spending like we normally do. Go to the grocery store, buy those provisions. I'm sure we've all been on our laptop a little more than we normally are, pulling up Amazon. I know I've bought a lot of stuff for our new member, as well as some additional household items that I probably would have put off for another 6 months. So I think consumers just by nature naturally stimulate the economy by doing what they do best, which is spend in any means that they can find. And in this case, a lot of that's going to be electronic. It's going to be online. It's going to be Amazon purchases. It's going to be ordering from DoorDash or the other delivery services. And in no way was that a plug for DoorDash. That just happened to come to mind. But these different delivery services. So I don't know if there's necessarily something that we specifically can go out and do to stimulate the economy other than continuing to be the primary driver of the economy as the consumer. We need to continue to consume.
Thank you. We encourage more questions from our network, from our ecosystem as well. We're thrilled to hear it from everyone and to see how engaged everyone is today. Lindsey, here's another question for you. We talked about the differences in your talk between a recession and a depression. And while we may understand that at a macroeconomic level, as it pertains to the average everyday American, no matter where we're living and no matter where we're remote working right now, what is the difference in the sense of what we could anticipate having that impact hit us directly?
That's a good question. And often we throw around recession and depression and use them interchangeably. And to be honest, they were interchangeable before the Great Depression. Economists tended to characterize any economic downturn as a depression. It was only after the Great Depression that economists said, well, wait a minute, we actually need to distinguish between a downturn, which we'll call a recession, versus an extreme downturn, which we'll call a depression. A recession technically is 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. And that can be a loss of a 0.5 percentage point, a loss of a full percentage point, but the focus is really negative growth for a specific period of time, which is 6 months or longer. A depressionary scenario is simply the extreme case of a recession. And the typical rule of thumb is a continued decline of more than 10%. So a recession can actually have a 10% drop on a 1-quarter basis. A depression is a continuous drop of more than 10%. So again, when we're talking about our base case scenario for the economy, we are looking for a 1-quarter drop of between 10 to 15%, but followed by a quarter of only a 5% drop. So here we have the technical 6 months of negative growth, but we don't have an ongoing 10% or more decline in GDP, negating the depression scenario, moving it to just a recessionary scenario. Both are very painful. But again, the difference is the depth and duration between a recession and a depression.
Lindsey, from the average American's perspective, are there historic differences in the ways in which that's felt, either from a pocketbook perspective or from an investment perspective, or just a life as we know it perspective?
Well, it's difficult to say in this case because we've never had this type of health-driven phenomenon as a cause of a recessionary period. And so it's going to be very difficult because remember, this isn't a market dysfunction. This isn't an economic breakdown. This is a forced economic closure to combat an external shock, in this case, from the health sector. So it's very difficult to compare, contrast, or even draw any sort of comparison to previous economic downturns because this is almost a self-inflicted recession. The government is forcing closures. Now, I think it rolls into the next question, which is, at what point do we say the cure is sort of worse than the actual impact of the virus? Now, remember, this is a double-edged sword because the longer that the administration keeps the economy shut in, the more difficult it's going to be for the economy to recover. The less likely it is that these businesses, particularly small businesses, are able to reopen on the other side. Of course, the quicker that we reopen the economy, if the virus isn't contained, we run the risk of the virus reemerging, leaving us really where we started. But of course, we do have to have the very uncomfortable conversation of at what point is it almost not economically realistic to keep the economy closed. We do know that right now, less than 3% of those testing positive are having extreme health ramifications. But that's only of those being tested. So if we extrapolate that out to the population, you're talking about less than 1% having extreme health ramifications because of exposure to this virus. So again, this is a double-edged sword, something that the administration and officials are grappling with. How do we balance shutting down an entire economy against the backdrop of those health statistics that we're currently working with? So again, this is an unprecedented time, an unprecedented scenario, and it's very difficult to not only draw a comparison to previous economic scenarios, but really get any sort of insight in how we should handle this going forward and how best to navigate getting the economy back on track.
Lindsey, to what extent is the impact that we're seeing in the stock markets directly related to COVID-19 versus just what some are saying is also given the fact that we were due for a correction? And does it matter?
It does matter. That's a very important point, because when we were coming into 2020, we have to recognize that the economy was already on extremely fragile footing. Now, I know there's a lot of economists that like to tout the economy was so strong and robust before the coronavirus hit, but that's simply not true. We were losing momentum from a 3% pace at the start of 2019 down to 2% at the end of 2019, going into 2020, with the consumer dramatically losing momentum from a 4% contribution down to 2%. And remember, 2% growth, as we just saw in this morning's GDP report, that came against the backdrop of massive government spending. We were already talking about $1 trillion deficits and historically low rates. And so 2% was really the bare minimum that you should expect. And with those types of accommodative policies, we should have easily been talking about 3-4% growth on a sustained basis. And yet we weren't. The economy was losing momentum dramatically going into the start of the year. So we were already very fragile, which painted a clear disconnect between what we were seeing in the equity markets, which is if you knew nothing about the U.S. economy, looking just at the stock market at the start of the year implied an economy on extremely strong footing. So at some point, you're absolutely right. We were already expecting a correction back down to reality, reflecting a longer-term run rate for domestic growth around 1.5, 1.8%. So part of that correction, I think, is a reflection of the realization that the U.S. economy was not quite as strong as some officials had touted. And then the additional reaction, and I shouldn't say the additional reaction, the ongoing reaction of 1,000, 2,000 point swings, I think that's more of the emotional reaction to the impact of the coronavirus. So we were already due for some downward pressure. The further downward pressure and wild swings that we're seeing, I think that's the emotional reaction to the coronavirus. So there's two different parts impacting the market. But I do think it's an important distinction, as you suggested, because on the tail end, as we come out of the coronavirus impact, once we have the virus contained, we still might not have enough momentum to get back to that pre-corona trend pace in the equity market, even if we do see the economy reemerge back to a trend growth pace of less than 2%.
Lindsey, you bring up a really interesting point around the emotional impact of behavior in the markets, and carrying that a step further in the sense of a final question for you around how do we as leaders, as executives, as business owners, as entrepreneurs ourselves, try to retain a sense of groundedness and not respond so emotionally in the decisions now that we make over the next couple of months as it pertains to just managing our own businesses and our lives?
It's a really difficult question. And I think the most important thing we can do is try and stay calm. I do know that watching the media can be very informative, but it can also be very, it can hype our emotions, where there's nonstop day-to-day coverage of the coronavirus. Every new case, every new death around the world is being reported. So sometimes distancing ourselves from that can actually be very beneficial. I do think that right now the focus should be on the longer term, trying to make immediate decisions based on day-to-day data or day-to-day timelines of when businesses are expected to reopen, when businesses are expected to be able to bring employees back, can be just incredibly frustrating. So I think as business owners, as business leaders, our job is to be calm. Our job is to focus on the medium to near term and try to come up with a longer term plan, as well as focus on some of these provisions and bridges that we can rely on to help navigate over this short period of time, and reminding ourselves that this is going to be a very brief moment. It's a big hurdle, but it's going to be a very brief moment of pain. We are going to come out of this in the coming weeks. So again, I think having that focus on the light at the end of the tunnel and trying to remain calm is the best that we can do.
Lindsey, Roger, thank you so much for being with us here today. Lindsey, congratulations on the new addition to your family. We look forward to hearing about all of your success as you continue to move forward this next cycle of your life as well. And Roger, thank you so much for being really very supportive and being a champion for Mayshad and for women's equity in the workplace and from a professional and personal perspective as well. Roger, how would you encourage everyone to stay in contact with you as well?
Well, thank you, Jen. It's been our pleasure. In terms of staying connected and being proactive, this is the time to have maximum communication with people from the health side, from the financial side, all of it. We've gone into a virtual world. It's now a lot of emails as opposed to face-to-face, and this virtual event is another example of how we've been leveraging the technology. I keep saying to myself and to folks how fascinating this is. If this happened 10 years ago, the medical side, ignoring all the advancements that we're currently doing medically, technologically, if we could we have worked from home like with the efficiency we're doing right now? Not a chance. None of us have the broadband capabilities to take care of this. So in some ways it's extremely challenging. In other ways, there's a lot of benefit that's going on right now. But stay engaged, be proactive, don't keep your head in the sand. From a financial side, Lindsey kind of touched on it. Do think long term. There's a great article that Warren Buffett penned in the depths of the financial crisis of 2008. If you Google it, you can find it. It's an op-ed that he provided to the New York Times in October of 2008. Read that. It gives you a great perspective of what you should be thinking about, I think about, from a financial side. So again, Jan, thank you. And if you all haven't had enough of Lindsey through this, I just got word internally that she's going to be on Bloomberg TV at 3 o'clock Eastern time today, so you can get another dosage. There'll be probably another update given the movement in the markets.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Remember to check us out at joinmayshad.com for more information about our upcoming live stream events. Our next event is slated for Monday morning, 10:30 Eastern Standard Time with clinical psychologist Dr. Risa Reiger. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good afternoon.